Catholic commentary.
You're returning at service. 2122.
Spiritual warfare.
A1 clear, see no trigger.
Stay ready so you don't have to get ready.
Jesus 911.
Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Santa Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostre. Amen. Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctifici nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Santa Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis.
Okay, we've got you on.
We are back. Jesus 911. My name is Jesse Romero. Mr. Engineer, are we on? Can you hear me? Yep. All
Yes,
right.
we are.
Excellent. Hey, I've been looking forward to this interview. This gentleman comes highly recommended by a lot of good Catholic friends of mine. I want to introduce and welcome Gary Taphorn. We're going to have a conversation. I'm going to consider this a holy hour of information. And we're going to talk about the most important thing that I want him to parse for us and to really distill is the difference between anti-Zionist and anti-Semitism. And so, Gary, welcome to the show, my friend.
You're not on. Hold on, just keep going.
Okay. So, Gary Taphorn will be on any minute now, any second now. And I'm going to be asking him a series of questions. It's a very important topic. We want to get to understand the difference between anti-Zionist versus anti-Semitism. Gary comes highly recommended to me, and I understand that he's an Army veteran, and he learned much about what we're going to talk about today about the Middle East during his time on active duty. So we'll be asking him. Paul, can you hear me? Is my friend Paul here? Mr. Paul Clay, are you here?
No,
okay.
no.
So let me just share an article with you before I get Gary on. It's called "The Church Cannot Sanction Zionism," put out by the Daily Night. And yeah, Rich, go ahead and let me know when Gary's on. Let me know.
Will do.
So more and more people are acknowledging how the violence of Zionist Jews renders them unworthy to occupy the land of Israel. So one of the things I'm going to ask Gary when he comes on is to define a Zionist Jew. The mere fact that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been giving millions of dollars to Hamas to aid Israel's assault on Palestine is glaring evidence of Israel's malice. I'm going to ask Gary what's the source for this and if this is the factual statement. The article says the Jews indeed have no moral right occupying Israel, no more than Russia has any right occupying Ukraine, since when are the Jews entitled to live in Israel? So of course, the argument here is going to be that the Jewish argument will be that they've occupied the land since the days of Abraham, that the land was given to Abraham by God, and that they're the offspring of Abraham. So that would be the Jewish argument, okay? And then of course they're also going to bring up that the United Nations gave the Jewish people or the Israeli people back this piece of land back in 1948 after World War II. The article says, "Let us not forget that Israel is the holy land where Jesus Christ, the maker of all things, lived and taught, and where he was put to death by the Jews." The article says, "If a group of mobsters murders the head of a household, does this entitle them to occupy this house? Only those Jews who honor Christ should be allowed in Israel. But Zionists should be deported. So my question about this article written by David Martin who would have the authority to deport the Zionists and allow only the Israelis that honor Christ to live there? Yeah, my question would be, who would have that authority? That would be very difficult to do. David Martin, on the article called "The Church Cannot Sanction Zionism," he says, if anyone would contend over this, let him consider the words of St. Pius X concerning Zionism. St. Pius X says, quote, "We were unable to favor this movement," and I presume St. Pius X is talking about Zionism. I'll ask Gary when he comes on. "We were unable to favor this movement. We cannot prevent the Jews from going to Jerusalem, but we can never sanction it. The ground of Jerusalem, if it were not always sacred, has been sanctified by the life of Jesus Christ. As the head of the church, I cannot answer you otherwise. The Jews have not recognized our Lord, therefore we cannot recognize the Jewish people. And so, if you come to Palestine and settle your people there, we will be ready with churches and priests to baptize all of you," close quote. That was written or stated by Pope St. Pius X to Theodore Herzl back in 1904. David Martin writes, "Some will contend that the Jews are God's chosen people, but when did Christ ever say this? The chosen people of the Old Testament merely prefigured the chosen people of the New Testament, who are devout Christians under Peter." The following is what Christ had to say about the Jews in their temple just prior to his second coming in Luke chapter 19, verses 43 to 45, where our Lord says, "The days shall come upon thee," talking about the Old Testament, the Jewish people, and he's saying this in front of the temple of Jerusalem. "The days shall come upon thee," referring to the Jewish people, the Israelites, "and thy enemies shall cast a trench about thee," referring to the Romans attacking them in 70 AD and destroying the temple, "encompass thee round, and straighten thee on every side, and beat thee flat to the ground, and thy children who are in thee." So our Lord is predicting the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem in 70 AD by the Romans. Our Lord says, "And they shall not leave in thee a stone upon a stone." That's in reference to the temple, that it'll be entirely destroyed, "because thou hast not known the time of thy visitation." And entering into the temple, he began to cast them out that sold therein, and them that bought, close quote. That's in Luke chapter 19, verse 43 to 45. So Christ is also talking about the money changers who were ripping people off inside the temple and turning God's house into a den of thieves. That's also what he's talking about there. David Martin writes, "Zionists might label this discourse anti-Semitic, but they need to look to themselves. It's the Jewish synagogue that is anti-Semitic, since it works against the welfare and salvation of the Semitic people by teaching them to grudge against the Christ." That's a good point right there. David Martin writes, "Some will argue that the Jews are still waiting for the Messiah, but if they don't recognize the Messiah that their fathers placed on the cross, they certainly won't recognize him when he comes again. There exists only one Messiah. The one they await will be the satanic counterfeit known as the Antichrist. They have their chance now to recognize the true Messiah of history. Needless to say, the church is bound to heed the words of Pius X concerning Zionism, since it was Christ who inspired these words in him." So, we're going to be having on to take a look at this Gary Taphorn, who's been highly recommended to me. He's an expert. He's done a deep study on the difference between anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism. And so I'm going to ask him a series of questions. Gary's an Army veteran, so much of what he learned about the Middle East, he learned it on active duty. And I'm going to ask Gary to elaborate on, first of all, his background and how he accessed the information that he's going to provide for us. He's a practicing Catholic. And then I'm going to ask him a series of questions, because what we want to know as Catholics, is there a difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? And Gary is going to parse that out for us. You're listening to Jesus 911. My name is Jesse Romero. I've been looking forward to this interview. And Gary Taphorn comes highly recommended to me by many Catholic folks that I highly respect. And so this is the topic that I'm interested in. I want to make sure I get this right. I want to make sure that I'm not, treading on thin ice or treading on theological error. And this is very, very important that we get this right. We'll be right back. Stick around. Don't go anywhere. Jesus 911. Hopefully, we'll be right back.
Genesis 1:27 says, God created man in his own image. Male and female he created them. According to Pope St. John the 23rd, it is not true that some human beings are by nature superior and others inferior. All human beings are equal in their natural dignity. May God help us to look upon everyone as a person created in his image and likeness, and treat everyone the same without favoritism or prejudice.
How does the baby move in your tummy? How does the baby eat? Can the baby hear me? How did the baby get in there?
Wow, a pregnancy can sure generate a lot of questions. But what's important is that a baby is a baby, inside and out of the womb. Not just after birth, but 9 months before, at conception.
That's right. Every baby is a miracle. Hello, my name is Marianne Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance, or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org, or better yet, simply dial pound 250 on your cell phone and say the keyword pro-life. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
A baby's heart is beating 18 days from conception. Pro-life across America, the Billboard people.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites The Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE, US 1.
Now, back to Jesus 911. If this call is not an emergency, dial 888-526-2151.
Recommended to me by many good Catholic friends, and Gary's going to be sharing with us the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Gary's an Army veteran. He's learned much about the Middle East during his time on active duty. I also got here my co-host Paul Clay. He's going to also be asking questions along with me. Gary, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you very much, Jesse. I appreciate the invitation.
Yep. Gary, tell us a little bit about your background, how you amassed all this information about the topic we're we're going to be embarking in?
Well, Jesse, I graduated from a Catholic college in Ohio way back in 1972. Went immediately into the Army, where I was served as a lieutenant and captain for about 12 years. And about the time I was making major, the Army gave me a chance to move from combat arms over to something called the Foreign Area Officer Program. In that program, you choose a area of the world, in my case, the Middle East, which of course is a big area. It runs from Morocco to Pakistan. And over time, I got a master's degree in Middle East studies. I became somewhat fluent in Arabic. And most importantly, I had 3 tours of duty in the Middle East, totaling about 6 years. Most of that time was spent in Jordan and in Egypt. In addition to that, I had 2 tours, one in the Pentagon and one at Central Command in Florida, where I worked Middle East issues. So over about a 15 or so year period, I became, I wouldn't say an expert, but certainly very well familiar with the problems that we have. Following that, after I retired, I got a job as a civilian in the Department of Defense, where I began to teach the same officers who were going overseas doing what I did, but these guys were maybe 10 or 15 years behind me. I feel like I've been very blessed by God to have this opportunity. If I had not been a Catholic, I guarantee you I would not be still following the Middle East today. But it's because the Middle East is so critically important. That dynamic of tension between the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims is very, very important. And I've learned a lot along the way, and I'm anxious to share with your audience whatever I can.
Well, Gary, you come highly recommended by Hugh Owen and many others. So let me ask you a question. Why does the issue of Israel cause such conflict or confusion for Catholics?
Well, there's all kind of reasons for that, Jesse. For starters, we could obviously say that Catholics are not as well catechized as they ought to be. And I would also add to that our bishops, our shepherds, frankly, tend to ignore a lot of the controversial issues. When's the last time you heard a bishop give a sermon about homosexuality, for example? So Zionism, anti-Semitism, in my view, is not controversial at all, but Zionism is very controversial. So that brings up, a factor as well. I would also say that there's been a vacuum in the media over the last 30, 40 years, about the time that the Israelis were kind of putting their mark on the wall with their victory in the '67 war. We saw the rise of cable television here in the United States in the '70s and '80s. And sadly, the Catholic bishops didn't really pick up on that. Neither, for that matter, did many traditional Protestant groups. But who did pick up on cable television were the messianic, the evangelist types, people like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and many, many, many more. So many Catholics have gotten their view about the Middle East and about Israel from non-Catholic sources. And the people who have inherited that approach to Israel include today people like who's our new ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee.
Yeah.
Who is
he's an evangelical rapture theologian. Yeah.
He really is. He cares not a whit for the Palestinians, even though many of them are Christian. And then I would say the last thing, Jesse, that makes Israel complicated is that you look at the political parties today. Let's just take the election last November, for example. You had liberal Democrats voting for Kamala Harris. You had conservative Republicans voting for Trump. And the differences between those two were dramatic in almost every area you can name, except for Israel. Israel was never a point of discussion during the debates. It was non-controversial as far as anyone in public audience was concerned, even though, in my view, and the view of many others, it is certainly one of the most controversial issues of our time. So a lot of things, fold together to answer that question for you.
Gary, would you also say that the teachings of the Second Vatican Council were softened as it comes to ecumenism and Israel and other religions? Would you say that also had kind of an influence on the reason a lot of Catholics have become very, very soft on this issue, or just poorly, they don't understand the severity of this issue because the teachings have been relaxed after 1965 on Jewish evangelism and ecumenism, etc.
Right. Well, you had the one document from Vatican II that everyone refers to is Nostra Aetate, which started out as a document meant to govern relations with the Jews. And after, I guess, many, many months of dabbling around, finally they decided, well, let's make it a bigger audience. Let's just talk about relations with non-Catholic or say, I guess, non-Christian sects. So therefore they folded in Islam and others. And then what many people don't know is that Pope Francis, on the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, that would have been 2015, he came out with another document entirely on his own. And you're right about the original document, that it softened the view that Catholics had of other religions, that in fact, maybe you can go to heaven without being a Catholic. I mean, that was kind of the general impression that it left. But Francis, in his 2015 document, did even more than that. He basically said that the church does not, I think I have the words right here, the church does not engage in institutional evangelism with the Jews. In other words,
I'm falling apart on
you. But, the idea.
Did Father Murr respond to you?
Let's say your diocese, if it wants to initiate a program where they would actually convert Jews, that's a no-no, according to the document of Francis. So it's hard enough to convert Jews even in Israel. If you try to do that in Israel, you're going to get tossed out of the country unless you've got a...
Rummel says it's good.
But,
Richard, Rummel just responded.
Okay, good.
Yeah, even in the United States now, or elsewhere around the world, it's the church has basically written off the Jews, which is sad. It's sad for the church and sad for the Jews.
Gary, this is the question that I really want to ask you, and I'm sure you'll be able to give us a good understanding. How would you define Zionism, and how is opposing Zionism as a Catholic different from anti-Semitism? Give us two working definitions so we understand exactly how to parse these two terms.
Sure. Well, I think actually in preparing for this, I wrote down all my notes about Zionism first, and then I said, well, I'll do anti-Semitism at the end, but I think I'm going to reverse that now. I'm going to start talking about anti-Semitism first, because that's the, let's say, the ideology that most people are familiar with. So anti-Semitism is basically just a fancy word for bias or prejudice against, in this case, against the Jews. There has been, anti-Semitism has been with us for over 2,000 years. We might get around to talking more about it later, but anti-Semitism actually predates the Catholic Church. It was the Romans themselves in ancient days were known to be very much biased against the Jews. So the bottom line is the church has taught us and taught us well over centuries that we cannot do that, that the Jews, whatever may be in their past or even in their future, whatever that may be, they remain first and foremost children of God, fellow brothers and sisters of Christ with us. And therefore, we have no grounds, no moral grounds, or any other kind of grounds of being...
To evangelize them. Right.
Well, we owe them, in fact, we owe them, not only should we not be persecuting them, but we owe them the truth of Christ. As a matter of fact, what's her name? Mother Miriam, you may probably know her, a Jewish convert to the... She made a recent statement here maybe a few months ago. She said that the most anti-Semitic thing you can do to the Jews is to deny them the truth of Jesus Christ. So we owe it to the Jews to not only not persecute them, but also to reach out to them and to bring the truth of the Christ and his church. Now, as for the issue of Zionism, Zionism is a new kind of a new boy on the block, if you will. Zionism is barely 100 years old. It began, we can trace it in two separate strands, if you will. One is what I call the Jewish strand, which occurred and rose out of Eastern Europe, where Jews such as David Ben-Gurion, Moses Pass.
Gary, hold that thought. We're going to a quick station break. Hold that thought, my friend.
Great.
You're listening to Jesus 911. I've got a high information Catholic, Gary Taphorn. We're talking about anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. We'll be right back. Stick around.
Hey, Terry Rodriguez. I'm a monthly donor here in Phoenix, Arizona. Retired Phoenix cop. And I've met Jesse before, and I just want to tell you guys were on fire yesterday on the Terry and Jesse show. You guys were on fire. I went to bed thinking, man, what an unwinnable war. But when I got up, I listened to you guys. You know, you guys are doing good work, man. You're doing God's work, and keep doing it. I know it gets exhausting sometimes, but there's people out here that really need the inspiration and the evangelization that you guys are giving us. So my best to you, and I'm Eddie Rodriguez. I'm a monthly donor and proud of it.
This is a catechetical minute from Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
God is love, and love is his first gift, containing all others. God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit, who has been given to us. Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 733. Everyone who has been given the breath of life has been given a puzzle to solve. To live well and happily is a mystery we try to unravel daily. Love is the answer that solves the mystery of life and unlocks the door to joy. Father, pour out your Spirit upon us, that we may live in the light of your love.
This has been a catechetical minute from Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Jesus 911. If this call is not an emergency, dial 888-526-2151.
We're back. Jesus 911. This is a topic that fascinates me, and I finally got an expert on the show that's going to be able to distill some of these terms and give us the differences. I've got my friend here, Gary Taphorn. You heard his bio. His bio is impressive. He's an Army veteran. He spent many years in intel in the Middle East. His background is absolutely impressive. He's a practicing Catholic, and he interfaces his knowledge of the Middle East with his Catholic faith. So right now, Gary, you were defining Zionism. Here's what you said before we had to go to the break. You said it's about 100 years old, and it arose out of Eastern Europe. Continue.
Right. Well, the Jewish strand of Zionism, which is going to be complemented by the Christian strand, originated in Eastern Europe. And I mentioned people like David Ben-Gurion, Moses Hess, Nathan Birnbaum. Nathan Birnbaum gave Zionism its name. This ideology that was becoming popular among the Jews of Eastern Europe, it needed a name, so Nathan Birnbaum gave it that name. And to proceed with that, I would define Zionism basically as an ideology. Some people would almost call it a religion, and some people have the faith in it and enthusiasm for it that is religious, but it really is not a religion because there's many Zionists who don't even believe in God. In fact, the original Zionists didn't believe in God. But it is an ideology that wants to establish and support a national state for the Jews in historic Palestine. It's simply that, and I should caveat that, not only for the Jews, but for the Jews alone. And this is part of what makes Zionism problematic. Okay, because Jews, for example, Jews live in almost every country in the world. They must live in 80, 90 countries. The two most populous countries in the world with Jewish citizens are Israel and the United States. But in the case of Israel, the problem has become, and it could have been anticipated all along, is that when the Jews moved into Israel and then eventually took charge of it, beginning in 1948 with independence, the rules of the game were not evenly laid down between the Jews and the other citizens of Palestine. You had Muslims, you had Christians who had been there for centuries. There are both Muslims and Christians who can date their families and their residency in historic Palestine back 2 and 3 and 4 centuries. And yet, because they were not Jewish, as the Jews set about establishing their state in 1948, there was huge, the word prejudice is the least volatile word I can think of. And basically, there was violence, there was persecution. Beginning in 1948, as soon as the Jews were given control of the situation, when the British left their mandate in Palestine. And so from that point on, the Zionists who have been in power in Israel have run a biased society, hugely biased society in many, many ways. And I would say this, and it's very important to mention that not every Jew is a Zionist, and not every Zionist is a Jew. A great example, a recent example of this would be in the New York Times back in February. You recall that Donald Trump made this outrageous proposal to basically export the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to Lord knows where, somewhere around the world.
Jordan, I think he said.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other issue too. Jordan already has more than its share of Palestinians, thanks to numerous other exiles over the last 70 years. So why should Jordan take any more? But nonetheless, these Jewish rabbis in New York, there were about 350 of them that signed a full-page ad in the New York Times condemning Trump's proposal to move the Palestinians, and they used the let's say the four-letter word that people don't like to use. It's not four letters, but the word they used in their advertisement was, "This would be ethnic cleansing. This is not what Jews should be about." So even though they were condemning Trump in their ad, in a way, they were also condemning their fellow Jewish Zionists who very much wanted the Palestinians to leave. So I want to make it clear that that the Jews are of two minds. Now, it's very much true. If you look at the, say, a snapshot of Jews in Israel versus Jews in the United States, and I don't know how you do this short of a public opinion poll, but it seems to me that Jews in the United States are far more open to equal rights and equal opportunity with other sects, to include Arabs, Muslims, what have you. When you get to Israel, this is where the percentage of Zionists in the population tends to grow very, very high. Right now, you can track polls in Israel that ask the question of Jewish citizens, what is our policy in Gaza? Is it about right? Is it too soft, or is it too hard? And inevitably, 70 to 80% of the population is going to say it's either about right, meaning keep on destroying Palestinians, or even make it harder, and only about 20% of the population, which tends to be the far left, actually, only about 20% is speaking out on behalf of the Palestinians and saying, no, this is not what Judaism is supposed to be about. So to summarize all this, Jesse, what I'd like to say is that as a Catholic, I must oppose anti-Semitism wherever I see it. And our church has done a great job of that over many years. We've got a follow-on question on that, I think, later on. But on the other hand, as a Catholic, I must also oppose Zionism, because if I don't oppose Zionism, I'm not following the rule, the law of Jesus Christ, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. Zionism fails on that one very obvious point, and if nothing else, that reason alone is enough to prevent Catholics from joining some sort of Zionist group.
Terry, why is Zionism so appealing?
Zionism is appealing for a number of reasons. The most obvious thing was the timing of Zionism, because just as the Jews of Eastern Europe were discovering Palestine in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, Adolf Hitler came along, and as a result of the Holocaust, sponsored by the Nazis and the Germans, there was a huge amount of worldwide sympathy for the Jews. So that added a certain sense of urgency about Palestine right after World War II. But beyond the urgency, there is also a certain romantic aspect of Zionism. People who don't really know the facts, whether they be biblical facts or historical facts from the Middle Ages or what have you, they think, oh, wouldn't it be great if the Jews could finally return to their homeland, which they've been longing to do for many, many years, and now finally the opportunity is here, and we should help the Jews in that regard. That was a very common attitude amongst Americans and most Westerners throughout throughout the post-world era. One of the problems of Zionism is, we can identify the problem by simply talking about the common lingo that was used going back even to the 1800s. The Zionists used to talk about Palestine will be a land that is without a people for us who are a people. In other words, Palestine is a land without a people, and when we get there, it will have a people. And that is a terribly misused and incorrect statement, but it's been used continuously for well over 100 years now. The reality is Palestine was occupied before Moses and Joshua brought the Jews in, some 1,400 years or so before Christ. And it has remained occupied all these years. The fact that the Jews left and went into their worldwide diaspora along about the 2nd or 3rd century didn't mean that Palestine was unoccupied. So the Muslims, who basically were probably Christians up until about the year 650 or so, the Muslims and the Christians who have lived in Palestine for well over 1,000 years have generally got along pretty well with each other. And that includes a small segment of Jews. Jews, for all these years, still live, a tiny fraction of Jews lived in Palestine. And those three communities, the Jews...
Gary, hold that thought. We're going to a quick station break. This is a cliffhanger here. Okay. I want to ask you next, on the next segment, what exactly was the Old Covenant, and how did it involve the Promised Land? That's the next topic I want you to cover on the next segment. We'll be right back. Stick around.
Here's a great way to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Do you have an old car you want to get rid of, motorcycle, RV, or boat? Simply call 855-500-7433, and when they sell that vehicle, a portion of that money comes right back to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio. It's an easy way to do it. I want to thank you for it. Call 855-500-7433. God love you and your family.
This message is for you. A great man once said that evil is powerless if the good are unafraid. But you and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness. We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind and has long climbed from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose this war, and in so doing lose this great way of freedom of ours, history will report with the greatest astonishment that those that had the most to lose did the least to prevent it from happening. Well, I think it's high time now that we ask ourselves if we still even know the freedoms that were intended for us by our founding fathers. Every generation of Americans needs to know that freedom exists, not to do what you like, but having the right to do what you ought. You weren't made to fit in, my brothers and sisters. You are born to stand out. Set yourself apart from this corrupt generation. Be saints. God bless you.
Buying Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE, US 1.
Now, back to Jesus 911. If this call is not an emergency, dial 888-526-2151.
We're back with Gary Taphorn. Fascinating conversation. I've got my partner Paul Clay on. He's on with me on Tuesdays. He's also going to jump in and ask some questions. Gary, you were talking about right now, the last question I asked you is what exactly was the Old Covenant and how did it involve the Promised Land? Here's my understanding real quick. The modern state of Israel is not the same as the Israel of the Old Testament. In other words, David established a kingdom, Solomon continued the kingdom, Jesus completed the kingdom, and the Catholic Church is the extension of the Davidic kingdom of Christ through Peter. How do you respond to that, my friend?
You have that exactly right, Jesse. So let me begin with one of the most important verses in the Old Testament, and it is the Lord speaking to Abraham, the father of the Jewish race. He didn't even realize he would have children at that point in his life. But in Genesis 15, verse 18, the Lord said to Abraham, he said, I promise to give your descendants all this land, because he was in Canaan at the time, all this land from the border of Egypt to the Euphrates River. That was the quid pro quo, so to speak. This is what the Lord would give Abraham. But in return, you don't hear this from Zionists today, in return, because it's a covenant, it's like a pact. It's an agreement between two sides who freely agree to do certain things. So the Zionists of today are very quick to quote that one verse in Genesis to us, and they, even to the point of saying, wait a minute, the Lord gave the land from the border of Egypt all the way to the Euphrates River, which is modern day Iraq. Does that not mean that the Lord wants Israel today to have Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Iraq? I mean, there are Zionists out there who think like that. And in fact, that is so totally opposed to the culture that we have been developed over many centuries about the various nation states of the world, each having individual rights that complement each other. So going back to God and Abraham, the Lord finished that sentence, that quotation to Abraham with this. He said, you must agree to keep the covenant with me, both you and your descendants in future generations. And God made the same promise, by the way, to Isaac and to Jacob. So then we have to fast forward 400 years because we have the grandchildren and beyond of Jacob wound up spending 400 years in Egypt in slavery. That takes us to the time of Moses. So we're about 500 years now after Abraham. The Lord is ready to take his Jewish people, his chosen people, out of Egypt, out of slavery, and into the promised land. And along the way, there's a stop at Mount Sinai where the Lord gives the text of the covenant, the 10 Commandments, and later on other commandments that found their way into the Torah. But the key point, Jesse, that I want to make here is that, again, this was a pact, a covenant where each side owed the other side something. And unfortunately, we can't go to any one verse in the Old Testament and point out what the Jews owed God in return, but we can identify a number of areas where Moses and later on the prophets spoke about this. So I just would like to quote two text here from Moses to the Jews while they were in the course of moving into the promised land, in which Moses pointed out, here's what you have to do. Here's what you have to avoid. Here's what you have to obey.
You're listening to Jesus 911. I've talking with Gary Taphorn with us. Go ahead, Gary.
Okay. So in the book of Leviticus, Moses said this to the Jews: do not make yourselves unclean by any of these immoral acts, for that is how the pagans made themselves unclean, those pagans who lived in the land before you and whom the Lord is driving out so that you can go in. Their actions made the land unclean, and so the Lord is punishing the land and making it reject the people who live there. Now, if that sounds to you like maybe homosexual activity, I mean, the concept of immoral actions, something like Sodom and Gomorrah, it does to me, although we're not clear, but I would point out to you, let's fast forward to year 2025, where today the city of Tel Aviv likes to advertise itself around the Middle East as the gay capital of the Middle East.
Wow.
So here's one example where apparently the Jews, at least of today, didn't pay any attention to Moses. Then here's a second quote, again from Moses. This one is from Deuteronomy, and it's quite similar. He says, even when you, referring to the Jews, even when you have been in the land a long time and have children and grandchildren, do not sin by making for yourselves an idol in any form at all. This is evil in the Lord's sight and will make him angry. I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you today that if you disobey me, you will soon disappear from the land. You will not live very long in the land across the Jordan that you are about to occupy. You will be completely destroyed. The Lord will scatter you among other nations where only a few of you will survive. And in fact, if you look forward from there, there have been not one but two instances where the Lord has basically expelled the Jews from the promised land. The first one we know, and it's recorded in the Bible as the biblical, the Babylonian captivity. You recall in your after David and Solomon, the 10 tribes of Israel were somehow lost to history. We have no idea where they went. They're just gone.
Yeah.
Obviously, they weren't very pleasing to the Lord. And then the remaining two tribes who were created the kingdom of Judea, they were the ones who 100 years later, the Lord allowed to be taken into captivity into modern day Iraq. And they remained there for about 70 years before the Lord inspired King Cyrus to bring them back. So both times that the Jews entered the promised land, it was clearly at divine inspiration. First time with Moses, the second time with King Cyrus. The third time the Jews entered the promised land, which is with the Zionists, beginning in the late 1800s, there's no evidence, there's no record of in any way of God being part of this. I mean, the Zionists had no use for God. They were bound and determined to become their own Messiah, if you will. So this is one of several reasons why we cannot look at Zionism and say this has got God's blessing behind it.
So Gary,
certainly that's one.
Hi Gary, Paul here. Listen, I think you're right on point when you say the key to understanding all of this is through the covenants. When you make this pact with God, this covenant with God, it comes with strings attached. One is if you obey God, then you enjoy the blessings of God. And in the case of it, and in the case of Israel, he had promised Abraham the land as an inheritance. But if you disobey the covenant, you fall under the curses of the covenant. And that's exactly what the Jews did. And so when you understand that their disobedience to the covenant, and according to the book of Romans, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that see not and ears that hear not,
Yes.
and understanding that Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of that and his kingdom. And when Pilate asked him, "Are you a king?" and he said, "Yes, you say," but his kingdom is not of this world. At this point, the promises and the blessings belong to the Catholic Church, the Israel of God, as Paul stated. And so, yeah, I totally, am agreeing with everything that you're saying, that the people who are now occupying the land are doing so at the behest, dare I even say, of Satan. Because if you remember, what the words of Jesus were to the high priest, he says, "I come in my Father's name and you receive me not. I tell you, another will come in his own name and him you will receive." So that this future restoration of Zionism, going back to the type and the shadow rather than the fulfillment and the reality of Christ, is offensive to God. It is not pleasing to God. And yet the Zionists, along with a lot of, Christians, Protestant Christians, evangelical Christians who have accepted this idea, are actually working to bring about the rise
reign
of
the
the
Antichrist.
That's right. Right, Jess.
Yeah,
Gary,
I'm glad you mentioned that, Paul in Romans there. Paul, I've got a list here of various quotations from Paul throughout his epistles, but Romans chapter 9 through 11, for the benefit of our viewers here, that tends to be the core of how Paul treats the Jews. Remember that not Jesus cried over the temple. He cried over Jerusalem, and Paul cried too. That's in one of his epistles, saying, "I cry for my Jewish brothers and sisters that they have let the salvation pass them by."
Yes.
Gary, hold that thought. We're going to have you back on Thursday. I'm telling you, this is so fascinating. Paul and myself, we're on pins and needles because we love this topic, and we finally have somebody who, an expert on this topic, a Middle East expert. We'd like to have you back on for part 2 this Thursday, same time, same podcast. Would that be okay? Because there's still some more questions that we want to ask you, and we've only got about 30 seconds left. Would that be okay to have you back on this Thursday?
That would be fine. I'm delighted to rejoin you and to share the word. Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Whoa, you've been listening to a fascinating conversation right now with Gary Taphorn, who's been parsing the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. We will continue this on Thursday on Jesus 911, part 2. Difference between Zionism and anti-Semitism with Gary Taphorn and my partner, Paul Clay. Thank you very much, Gary, for coming out. We'll see you on Thursday. Keep it here on vmpr.org. God bless you. Keep the faith.
Thank you, guys.
Saint Faustina's Prayer for Priests. O my Jesus, I beg thee on behalf of the whole Church, grant it love and the light of thy Spirit, and give power to the words of priests, so that hardened hearts might be brought to repentance and return to thee, O Lord. Lord, give us holy priests. Thou thyself maintain them in holiness. O divine and great High Priest, may the power of thy mercy accompany them everywhere, and protect them from the devil's traps and snares, which are continually being set for the souls of priests. May the power of thy mercy, O Lord, shatter and bring to naught all that might tarnish the sanctity of priests. For thou canst do all things. Amen. Virgin most powerful, pray for us.
Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.